I'm Jenna Seery, a bookseller and associate producer of Poured Over, and today I am so excited to be joined by Torrey Peters, the author of Detransition Baby, which was a critical and popular hit and something that I have thought about for a long time. And so I am so excited to be talking today about Stag Dance, which is a collection of stories and a novel and just an entire work as one that I couldn't stop once I started, even though sometimes I was not sure what I was reading in the very best way. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for putting that so diplomatically.
I know that this collection of work took you a long time to sort of compile and put together. I know that there are pieces that you've had out in other ways before and just things you've been working on for a long time. So I was hoping we could start with you just talking a little bit about how you compiled these pieces together.
Sure. So I think that it took about 10 years to get all of these. And it started as a project that I had envisioned. I was part of a kind of like indie or cultish, not in a religious way, but like a kind of like this trans writing scene that was like, meant a lot to like not a huge number of people, but those who it meant something to, it meant something to them really strongly. And it was based out of Brooklyn and around like 2014. And during that time, there was a press that was publishing trans writing, but I was like, what'd be really cool is if trans women all just started publishing our own writing. And so I envisioned this project where I was going to publish a bunch of novellas, each in a different genre. And kind of the point of this was also to show that like that trans stories aren't sort of like a niche thing that like, can only be done in sort of experimental writing or some, weird theory to understand it, that actually they're like the lives of trans people, the things that I go through are like, easily recognizable in like popular narrative forms. So I started writing them and I wrote two, which was the first was Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones, which was, and each one kind of took on like a different theme, a different concern that I had. So Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones is kind of about community and the double-edged sword that is community. The second one was called The Masker, and it was horror. And then the third was a soap opera. And the thing about soap operas is they're very, very long. And that soap opera, and with all the melodrama and like the twists and turns, became Detransition Baby. So this project of writing a bunch of novellas ended up leading to my first book, Detransition Baby. And then when Detransition Baby was over, I was like, well, it was over, but it was published and out in the world. It's over, it's done. When it was out in the world, I was like, I think I'm going to go back to it, with a totally different, in a totally different place in my life, and kind of finish out the cycle that I envisioned. So the final two are The Chaser, which is like teen romance, and about the way you kind of like narrativize your past, maybe post-transition. And then the last is Stag Dance, which is the title story that also got really long, and it's like a short novel, which is like a tall tale, kind of like a Western frontier story, in which I was kind of taking on what might it be, which bodies, what kinds of people are often chosen as like, oh, sure, that person could transition, but that other people couldn't. And it's about a really giant lumberjack who wants to go to a frontier dance or like a logging dance in the role of a lady. And I had fun with that one. I mean, I had fun with all of them, but that one especially.
And that one is very fun to read as well. I had fun with all of those. And I really like what you said about telling these trans stories that are just regular stories of life. They're not, it doesn't need to be this grand experiment. It doesn't need to be sort of all of these different, acceptable ways to tell a story. I think a lot of times, like, trans narratives get either categorized into it has to be such a profound work. It has to be the best version of that, or it has to be the very safe, this is my transition story. It seems those are, the ways that it is acceptable to tell a story. And yet that's not life. That's not the experience that people have.
No. And I think, once they were all grouped together, it was interesting to see the themes come up, because in the end, I discovered maybe 3 or at the most 5 characters in all of these, in this collection of 4 pieces. Only about 3 or 4 characters identify as trans would say like, I'm trans. The rest are just people who have like weird feelings about their gender, weird feelings about their sexuality, like are trying to figure out their own desires. And like, for me in the end, I think that's that the seeing them revealed something to me, which is that, I don't know if these are trans stories in a sort of identity way, and that they're more just kind of or let me put it this way, that I think that when people talk about transness, they think that they're talking about a binary between uh, men and women, and people who break the binary between men and women. But I think that the binary that this collection is more interested in is a binary between cis and trans. That actually it's really hard to say this person's trans, this person's not trans, that the desires that like trans people have are desires that everybody has. And that the desires that everybody has are also, desires that are often very developed by trans people. And that what's trans about the story isn't people being like, oh, I'm trans and here's my identity. It's kind of that I've been around trans people enough that I've developed a kind of lens to look at gender. And let me see how that lens can be applied to all sorts of different stories, rather than a kind of like, story of like coming out and declaring, in language, this is the kind of person I am. It's really more like about, let's look at how people live and what our feelings are and what we want.
And coming back to those ideas of wanting to be seen, wanting to be loved, to be cared for, both by ourselves and by other people.
Yeah.
And the ways that that can be frightening, the ways that that can be inspiring, the ways that it can seem daunting. That's there, and that's human, no matter your gender, your expressions, the way you feel. There's something to be seen and wanting to be seen.
Yeah. And, I think you said that very well. I think that the idea that you want to be like loved by somebody who really recognizes you, I think is in all four of these stories, and and not only that, but the impediments that we throw up to being, ourselves, to being loved. The chaser, for instance, that's told from the perspective of, like a teenage guy who's kind of like a bro. And I would say that this is like bro thinks of himself as quite, hetero and all these, and he wants to be tough and he wants to be respected. And his ideas of how to be tough and how to be respected actually are like the obstacle for him to not having love. Because in some ways he has a kind of love, but into like accepting love. And so that's a story that's not a trans person. That's a bro. That's like the most in the way that people set things up. It's like this is the opposite of a trans girl, is like some bro. And actually, like, I feel as close to that bro character as I do to the characters who and I recognize, that character as much as I do characters who, are out as like, I'm trans.
And on first glance, a lot of the characters in this story seem to be living or operating outside of what maybe most of society would deem as like normal or safe or acceptable.
Yeah.
And that could very well be true, but I also think these characters, they have their own operating system. They have their own set of expectations, and it's not really that different from what most people in the mainstream world are living in. It's just that there are some different features.
Yeah, and I think that actually, like, I'm kind of drawn to, I mean, I think that Detransition Baby was kind of my attempt to like kind of play with kind of mainstream desires, to play with like sort of Sex in the City style, relationship dynamics and stuff like that. In some ways, I think, especially something like the Stag Dance, the title story, was a little bit like a reaction to doing that. Like, okay, I've done, a woman in the city, domestic kind of family question. I want to do something that's like way outside of it. I want to do something that's totally different. And at the time I was writing it, I was building a sauna in like the middle of nowhere in Vermont, literally in the middle of the woods. You can't drive to it. And so I was like spending time with like, I was learning to use like a chainsaw to cut down trees to build the sauna. And I just began thinking like, kind of like, I spent all this time thinking about gender, and then it's like in the middle of the woods, it's like, what is my gender when I'm like using a chainsaw in the middle of the woods? And it's not that women can't do that or, that I'm gendering it. It's just sort of like there's all these stereotypes around these kinds of things. And oftentimes it's other people who are confirming them or denying them. And I was like, well, I'm alone with a chainsaw, cutting down trees. What's going on? What do I have a gender? What does this mean? And I began thinking about that, like, especially in terms of other places. So I ended up writing about a logging camp. And the more I kind of got into that logging camp, I got into like the voice of this logger. I found this book of slang from like loggers it was from 1940s. And it was the children of loggers who were recording like the slang that their parents, mostly their dads, used. And I was like fascinated by this like lost language of logger slang. So then I started writing it in logger slang and came up with these weird kind of turn of the century cadences. And it ended up being like probably as different as Detransition Baby as you could, it's like it's in this dialect, it's in logger slang, it's about cutting down trees in the woods. It's like pretty far from Detransition Baby, but in a way, like, they feel like reaction, counter reaction, like that. They in some ways they go together in a very bizarre way.
It's like, if a tree falls in the forest, does it have a gender? Is the real question.
Exactly. Yeah, totally. Well said. Yeah.
I love Stag Dance particularly because I am from Minnesota, the home of Paul Bunyan himself.
Yeah.
And it just feels like there are things that it's like they're ringing bells. Like I feel that connection to it. Yeah. And yet I love the idea of taking something that feels so like American and red-blooded and like this is our, an Americana story and being like, okay, there was other stuff going on too. And what if there was, what else is going on in those places that we maybe haven't thought about?
Totally. Like I was thinking, one of the sort of the cadences that I was like trying to get into was like a sort of like comic Americana voice, which I think is actually in something like, Moby Dick or in like certain Coen brothers movies that are doing this kind of stuff. Like it's comic, but it's also like kind of like serious and the characters a little bit like earnest and charming, but also maybe sometimes not always the brightest, but just speaking of like Moby Dick, like you get into Moby Dick and you're maybe, I don't know, 20 pages in before he's like, spooning the harpooner in bed and that, yeah, in these spaces that are frontier spaces, the rules of society that we have now, they didn't hold. Men, like I found out the premise of Stag Dance is that these loggers throw a dance, and that any logger who wants to come to the dance as a woman, because they're in the middle of the woods in the winter, they're not leaving the woods, they're going to be alone together for the entire time that they're logging. Anyone who wants, and they miss women, so anyone who wants to come to the dance as a woman cuts like a brown triangle and hangs it over his crotch, and then he can go to the dance as a woman. And the main character, who's like this big, strong Paul Bunyan type, but very ugly, decides that this is what he wants. But anyway, that story, I got that from a book called Redressing America's Frontier Past, which is an academic book about how, men actually lived on the frontier in the railroad camps, in logging camps, in these places where there weren't any women. And they had whole systems and whole languages and like a bunch of stuff that like, came down from in tramp languages, now kind of like prison slang and like all this stuff is kind of queer slang from the frontier. Yeah, and again, certainly like whalers on boats out at sea for a long time. There was whole kind of worlds of relationships between men in which they took on gender roles, in which they had different desires, and that those desires couldn't be sort of like marshaled into like everyday society as we see it now.
And having those moments of being able to look at our past and be like, oh, there's things there that we need to remember, and that these people lived valid, full lives, and
yeah,
we just don't know, or we don't think, or we don't look, I guess I should say, often into these spaces.
that their consciousness and their like experience of the world was somehow like fundamentally different than ours, or things that like trans people are doing now, or like creating new forms of consciousness that never existed before. I don't believe that. I believe that like if you read, again, the American classic Moby Dick, you discover on page, whatever it is, 20, the same forms of consciousness that supposedly are just being invented now. Like they're with us all along. This is woven into ideas of Americana.
And I think that kind of like scares people sometimes to think about, because not that there isn't sort of inherent danger in talking about transness and talking about gender and sexuality in our world today. There is sometimes that piece that comes with it, but people are so afraid to look back and have to reckon with things that are different than what they thought.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that the things that actually the stuff that they had tried to sort of push out are actually like fundamental to the things that they admire,
Yes. And I love the worlds that you create in these stories that are so different and rich. I mean, Stag Dance itself has this very, like you said, you use this slang, you create this world that's so specific. And then you have a Quaker school that I, felt like I understood what was happening. You talk a lot about pigs, and I got a little scared of them in several of these stories because they're intense. But I know you have a background in nonfiction as well, and it feels like you really can create worlds that feel true with these facts that you give us.
Yeah, the pigs thing, I went to, I actually went to a boarding school that raised pigs. They had like a Swedish system of, it wasn't organic, it was like a Swedish system of raising pigs. And your chores, if you were like got in trouble, which I did get in trouble, were that you had to like pick up after the pigs, and they're gigantic. They weigh like 600 pounds. And so I've always kind of had this like of all the animals, pigs are I just have weird feelings about pigs, and pigs and mice. I also like I've had mice infestations like when I've lived in the woods, and like just really freak me out. So the pigs and mice in this and I just started adding. I was like, well, I think it's kind of fun when authors add in their own like phobias and obsessions, because when like a lot of times I'll run into something like an author is kind of obsessed with. Like if I read like Haruki Murakami, there's always cats, in Murakami. And it's like, I'm not that into cats, but like you're clearly obsessed with like cats and pasta. And I kind of appreciate the fact that like cats and pasta and jazz, like, if I get a Murakami novel and there's not cats, pasta, and jazz, I'm like, was it even written by Murakami? And so I was kind of like, well, I have a thing with pigs, so I'll just start throwing that in wherever I want.
I think that when you can pick out those details and you're like, oh, I'm seeing like the full thing. I'm getting the voice. The author is here with me in this moment. And it's a reassuring feeling, because when I think maybe it was like also watching the movie Hannibal too young, and like there's a lot of scary pig action in there.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great I also like there's the pig monologue from Snatch with Brad Pitt, where the gangster is talking about how fast pigs can eat a body or whatever. And that because I have like a thing with pigs, that that really stuck with me for a long time.
I love that. I think it helped me sort of like connect into these stories and these voices, because some of these characters are not people that necessarily I would be like, oh, that is someone I feel similar to, or that I would gravitate towards. And yet, in all of these voices that you create that are so vastly different, I'm ready to be like, okay, well, I'm going to go with where you're taking me. And I was hoping we could talk a little bit about your process for finding these characters' voices, because they're all very distinct.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I mean, and I agree with you that, like, one of the things I think when you were talking about these stories about trans stories where they have to be like sort of like overcoming, or these grand tragedies, is that you have like heroic characters that are like supposed to like sort of represent well trans experience. And like I've always been interested much more in like, and it's in Detransition Baby too. I've been interested in problematic trans women. I've been interested in people who, I think the most fun books are not people who are always like behave heroically, but are can be villainous, can be problematic, can be difficult. And so, I kind of am like, well, why wouldn't I write characters who are villainous and problematic and difficult? Because that's what's fun. And I think the challenge then for me as a writer is like, how do I get people to sort of like see it their way? How do you get a reader to sort of see it the way of somebody who they normally would totally disagree with? And to some degree, that's the work I think of all fiction, is to kind of create empathy. But there's something like a little perverse, or like I'm a little gleeful when people are when there's a character who they're like, this character is repellent, but I felt bad, or like I wanted them to win or something like that. There's like that kind of reversals when you can when I both experience it as a reader, when I'm rooting for someone who I find repellent, these things happen. Like I love those moments in fiction. They just excite me. And moments of cruelty, I think that like, and I don't mean cruelty in sort of brutality. I mean the sort of like intimate, like cruelty that comes out of intimacy, and that has like, when I read something where like there's a book, Laughter in the Dark by Nabokov, which I think is like just one of the cruelest books ever written. And it's cruel not only to its characters, but it's cruel to me as a reader. I read it and I'm like, oh, you're just being cruel to me, Vlad. Like I'm rooting for these characters, and look what you've done. And that those feelings, they feel like the full human experience. And I love packing them in if I can.
I felt that way finishing The Masker and reading the last bits there and being like, okay, what a way to end us out here, Torrey. What a way.
Yeah. It was like, I thought about the order, right, of the stories. I think that the logical thing, and that most people do, is they end, if it's novel, they end it with the longest piece. So the logical way to end is on Stag Dance. But I kind of wanted to end on like just like a weird feeling gut punch, and that in a strange way, I think The Masker, although no spoilers, like we said, we're trying to spoil free. The Masker is like, the story is the bleakest. When you step back as a reader, it's the most hopeful, because you can actually see what actions that character could have taken to make things work out better. That like it's the clearest. And so like I think a reader can walk away from The Masker even being like, okay, what that character did, whew. But you as a reader can be like, but weirdly, I feel that I could go into the world after this, seeing what a good choice would be, and it's, I think in some ways of all the things I've ever written, it's the least ambiguous in sort of pointing towards a hopeful future, which nobody will give me credit for, because they're like, that was the most disturbing ending. What's wrong with you? But to me, in my head, yeah, there's hope. There's like there's not hope for that character, but there's hope for the reader, and that's what I care more about, the readers in the end.
And it does allow something I love when I read, and it goes back to mentioning empathy and understanding, is I love reading something that I feel like I can put myself into, as well as I'm getting something back out. And though I think that story, and when people read it, they'll understand, it may seem antithetical to want to put yourself into that story, because it is so heavy and there is all this shame and cruelty, but yet I agree that when you finish it and you let it sit, it lets us think, it lets us understand, it gives us a reflection back in a way that isn't just about, this is something awful that happened and now you have to feel awful about it.
Yeah, I mean, just so just tell that story is a little bit about fetish, and about like people who think that their gender is just a fetish. And that story was one of the ones that I self-published, in that sort of like scene. And I think that story is the story that I got the most kind of people responding to me, basically being like, I was stuck in my life and I read this story and I so much didn't want to end up like these characters that I made a big decision and change something in my life, that like that sometimes that's the way that fiction works. You're not sort of inspiring people, but you're kind of basically being like, here's the model for how something works. And if you see that you're making these same choices, let me now portray these same choices in a way that's horrifying. I mean, it's a horror story. And maybe there's something else, some other choice that you might make, some way to unstick yourself rather than a sort of through a kind of, typical self-help, here's how to change things. And, I'll say that like there's pieces of me in all these stories. So like when I'm cruel and stuff like that, I hope it's not like gleefully cruel to like others. Like, the person I'm sort of being cruel to is like shades of myself and versions of myself, and myself in moments that maybe I look back on, or maybe I still am. Not always so righteous.
I think it falls under, and many of your works fall under this for me, this idea of writing that challenges me, and not in a way that I feel like I'm fighting with the text, because I feel like I've read plenty of things where I've seen people say, oh, this is really a challenge, it's going to challenge you. And I'm like, no, I think I'm just fighting with this. I think I'm just, I'm losing the battle here. But this lets me, your work, especially Stag Dance, especially The Massacre, they let me slow down. They let me understand. And it forces me to like look at something that is easy to just say, oh, that's not a story for me. That's a story for somebody, but it's not for me. And it's like, well, but why? And do I need to start looking at things I think aren't for me and say, oh, is that the reason it is for me to read?
I mean, that's I'll say to you, I am grateful for you as a reader, because that's that's something that I strive to do also as a reader. And it's hard, because that sometimes you don't want to read things that are hard, and I hear you. And what I hope I do, though, these are genres, in some ways genre stories, and that I hope that basically, even as that's happening, I'm giving people enough like sort of intrigue, suspense, tension, humor. I think that it's dark humor sometimes, but I think that a lot of it, to me, they're funny, and that I try to give people like enough that like, okay, if you're going to wrestle with this, I hope it's like a fun wrestling match. It's like an opponent that you enjoy their style, you enjoy what they're bringing. And that's always, I've never wanted to like, be, I don't know, the kind of writer who you need a appendix or like some sort of professor to teach you why this is an enjoyable experience. I want it to be like sort of intuitively, you're having a good time, because that's also what's fun to write. Like I like to have a good time while I write it, and like my favorite scenes are ones where I'm sort of like, going like like laughing or like, "Ooh, look what I did," or something like that.
There is a lot of, I think, like in a most general sense, play in your work. There's a lot of motion. There is a lot of, I mean, you're giving us not only these great voices, plus beautiful sentences on just like a writing level. There's so much to sink into, but yet I can feel you looking at us and watching us read this through the work. You're like, I know what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think that also like you have to like, in this moment, I'm competing as a writer, and all writers are competing right now with so much. Like I understand that people have television, internet, like, there's so many different movies, like so many things that are competing with stories and competing with for attention and for all those things. And so I try to sort of be aware that like I'm not writing in 1905 when there was nothing to do but so hand stitch things by candlelight, or read, that like there's a lot happening, and that I want to give people reasons to sort of like enjoy it, laugh about it, and then talk with their friends about it. I want it to be as fun as the things that I'm competing with.
And I love a short story. I think that like that is such a challenging art. It is such a specific thing to be able to create a story that works, that fills all the boxes in a short thing. And I think I know so many people that are resistant to them. And I'm like, no, if you have time to like scroll on Instagram for 20 minutes, like you could read a short story.
Well, the form is really interesting because, like, technically, I couldn't. One of the reasons I published self-publishes is that I couldn't publish them as short stories. They're too long. They're this length that I love, which is somewhere like over about 13 or 14,000 words, but less than 20,000 words, with the exception of Stag Dance, which is like 42,000, which qualifies as a short novel according to my publisher. But like, 15,000 words is too long to get published, even in like the New Yorker or the Atlantic. They're just so long. And so that was one of the reasons I self-published, is I was like, oh, they're actually it's to me, this is a perfect length for this era, right? Like you have an hour commute on the train. Well, between going to work and back, you can have a complete immersive world. It's not like, a super short story where you don't get, it's sort of like an exercise. This is an immersive world, but it's like the size of a commute or of an hour. Commercially, they're really hard to do, right? Because you have to basically publish them as standalone. So you spend all the money to publish it, but you can't really charge what a whole book is. So to me, it's the perfect length, but it's not commercially viable. And so it's like only now that I have four of them can I kind of stick them together in a book and sell it that way. But to me, like, each one should kind of give you the experience of a book, or at least a novella book. And that when I self-published them, they were little books. Each one was a little book.
Yeah, I think this is honestly the first time I've ever seen a novel and stories on a book. And it was enough too to be like, oh, we don't have to publish things just only the way that we have always published them. It's like, what is a short story? What is a novella? What is I mean, I know that there are appropriate and standard answers, but it's also like, well, we don't have time for that anymore.
No, and I wanted to say 3 novellas and a short novel on the cover, because that's actually what it is, but or 3 novelettes and a novel or something like that. But that's so like esoteric, and like, they couldn't do it. And in fact, country to country, with this book, the translations, they have completely changed that. So in the United States, it's a novel and stories. I think in the UK, it's called a quartet, which is different than short story collection, because short story collections are usually like 10. But this is a quartet in the UK. And in Germany, I think it's like the most interesting. It's like a figure in 4 is like what is the way they said it. And a figure is also kind of like the word for text. It's a kind of a play on words, like a text in 4. And it's basically that, like, there isn't a real word or easy description for this. But I do think it's something that people used to do. Like when Thomas Mann published Death in Venice, he published Death in Venice, and then he threw in a couple other things at the end of Death in Venice. And that was like, back then that's what readers wanted. It used to be like movies. You go to a movie and there'd be like the movie, and then there'd be a couple shorts beforehand, like, I don't know. I'm for it.
I think that I'm for authors being able to tell stories in the right amount of pages, whether it's a novel, whether it's a short story, whether it's something in between. Sometimes what you want to tell fits in a specific thing, and sometimes it doesn't. And I think it's very funny the way that we like categorize everything. Our need to categorize into what is this piece of literature.
Yeah. And I understand it. People want to sell books, and it's easier to sell books when you can say what it is. But it's also, I think you might be right that, like, this is a moment in which, like, maybe a figure in 4 is what is needed, rather than like a novel or a collection or whatever, other things people say.
We'll figure it out eventually. It's always in progress.
Yeah. And I like that. And I like that publishing is like constantly in progress.
I'd love to talk to you a little bit, since we're talking about publishing and things as a whole, some of your literary influences and some things that you've been loving recently.
Yeah, like I said, I came out of this scene that was trans writers in Brooklyn around 2014. And so there the series of writers that I wrote with then, Imogen, Binnie, Sybil Lamb, Casey Plett. Imogen wrote a book called, at the time, Nevada. Casey Platt wrote a book called A Safe Girl to Love, which was stories. Sybil Lamb wrote a book called I've Got a Time Bomb. And having been part of that is just, and especially its attitude towards how to tell trans stories, which is to sort of not over explain them. I think that really marks my work. And then, since then, I've gone through all sorts of different periods. While I was reading Detransition Baby, I was reading a lot of divorce novels. So I was reading like Elena Ferrante, I was reading Rachel Cusk, I was reading a lot of stuff like that. And then I think as I was writing Stag Dance, I was just reading like kind of weirdo voice stuff. Like I really loved Marlon James' A Brief History of Seven Killings, which was so voice heavy and so kind of pulpy and also like really brilliant political analysis. I read the Blood Meridian when I was doing this. I kind of like also like the funny, weird Americana voice, which I think like the oh my God, I'm blanking the author's name, but I read True Grit that the Coen brothers made a movie out of. It's a writer called Wells Tower who had this great story about called Everything Ravaged, Everything Burned about Vikings, and the Vikings kind of talk like surfer dudes. And it's just a joy and like incredibly moving. And then what am I reading now? Now I'm kind of like the thing is now there's so many trans books coming out. And because of Detransition Baby, I get asked to blurb like I would say half of them. So I'm pretty up on like trans writing. And I think there's like 12, 15 coming out even this spring, which is great for me because I think when Detransition Baby came out, I was like asked to represent trans writing. And now there's so many other, Den Michelle Norris has a book coming out. Jamie Hood has a book coming out called Trauma Plot. Aaron Walker has a book coming out called Aggravated Discontent. There's a trans romance about tennis players called Hot Girls with Balls. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's just basically, if you want this, it's coming out. That's just Jean Thornton, ASL, Anton Selinek, a book called A Realistic Fiction. I mean, there's so much. So I have been reading so much of that stuff. And then but I also like these days I've been trying to I read my next book I want to write sort of like a kind of like political economic thriller. So I've been reading books that have like political economy in them, and by that I mean books that were sort of like money and politics plays in. So you can think of like Wolf Hall. I started reading Taipan by the guy who wrote Shogun, which was that FX series. I don't know, just very eclectic reads. Oh, I actually want to shout out this writer. I'm in Colombia right now, and I just want to say this writer who I think is kind of he had some renown in like 2011. He wrote a book called The Sound of Things Falling. His name's Juan Gabriel Vasquez, and I think he's probably like the most famous writer out of Colombia right now. But I don't see him talked about that much in the United States, and I think he's exceptional. Like his books are he had a book called The Shape of the Ruins in 2017 about conspiracy theories that it was fiction. It's kind of like I don't know, this amazing like rolling Colombian history, like definitely like a kind of like answer to Garcia Marquez. Yeah, he's got two new ones out, and Juan Gabriel Vasquez just and I've been trying to learn Spanish, so I've been trying to take him on a little bit in Spanish with like some English translations nearby, but really, really terrific.
I love that. I love getting to hear sort of how all the pieces come together in someone's reading and writing life and always get what's new on the horizon because I think there is so much incredible stuff being put out right now that there's just so much to like, any direction you want to go, there's something new.
Yeah, it's true. It's really true.
And now that we're going to have Stag Dance out in the world, I was wondering if you have sort of like a perfect reader or someone you really hope encounters the book out in the wild.
I think I dedicated the masker back when I first wrote it, I dedicated it to my former self at her most afraid. And that is kind of who I think I would like this for. Somebody who the reason that they think that they wouldn't like it isn't that they don't relate to it, but that they're afraid. You know, I think there's a lot of fear right now. I think that oftentimes just like direct polemics, like you shouldn't be afraid, blah, 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 they can just bounce right off the armor that we all develop. And that fiction has like a funny way of like slipping in through the side around, and that it can sort of dismantle shame and fear in ways that kind of straightforward talking about them doesn't. So I think there's probably some readers out there who are afraid of this stuff in ways that I was probably once afraid of it, and it's for them.
I love that. And I can't wait for people to get their hands on it and to really sink into these worlds you've created. So, Torrey, thank you so much for being here.
Well, I just want to thank you for reading so thoughtfully and your attitude towards reading. It's just a pleasure and a gift. So thank you so much for doing this.
Thank
and
you.
selling books too. Thanks for selling our books and all the things you do. Thank you.
Thank you. And Stag Dance is out now, so I can't wait for everyone to read it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.